Thanks for staying up later. Happy to have Hugh Hefner with us tonight and tomorrow. Coming up on 40 years for Playboy magazine. I guess December of '53 was the first issue. But before we get to that, they tell me that you don't venture from the mansion very much at all.
True.
How often do you leave the grounds? I mean, the grounds are large enough that it's probably a day trip just to get to the border, but...
Not very often. This is a rare... But this seems a lot like home, so comfortable.
This is like the surroundings of the...
a little bit.
We have a little grotto back here with a jacuzzi,
yes.
A place we like to go to relax. How important do you think Playboy is now on the American scene? I mean, obviously it's still a successful magazine with a circulation of about 3.5 million, but how important is it?
More important than I would have expected that it might be. After almost 4 decades, it's remarkable how we were still in the center of the storm. And in other words, I think that's because the last decade has been a lot like the 50s. In other words, the 80s for me were a lot like the 50s, fighting a lot of the same fights again, a lot of the same controversies again, a lot of them related to sexual hang-ups again. So that Playboy remains in a kind of a unique position, I think, and speaks to a man's world from a particular perspective, and I think it's important.
Did it shape the times or merely reflect it?
Both, I think. You know, it's hard to separate, I think, anything from the rest of what was going on around it, but I think that the magazine has, without question, played a part, and was saying things back in the early 50s that very few other people were saying.
Do you think the decline in circulation, and again, this is relative, 3.5 million is still big-time circulation, but in the early 70s it was almost double that. Is that a result of changing attitudes and sensibilities so that people say, hey, I'm rejecting Playboy, or is it a result, in a way, of almost being so successful that you do yourself in that the sexual revolution took hold, and it wasn't as exciting or novel or titillating to grab a Playboy magazine anymore? I mean, the landscape changed, partly perhaps because of Playboy, so it couldn't be at the cutting edge anymore.
I don't think we've been playing on a level field for the last 15 years. In other words, the magazine and the rest of what we do, it's also true in terms of our video, doesn't really operate in a free market. In other words, we suffered in the middle 80s with a form of censorship that dramatically curtailed the single copy sales of the magazine. Remember the Mies Commission? Remember 7-Eleven stores? Well, we lost many, many thousands of outlets. And I don't think the magazine can ever again be, you know, the same thing that it was in the 60s and early 70s. I think that was a special time, and you can't recapture that particular moment. But, you know, the magazine remains very much what it is. The magazine that I think, in a very real way, has changed the world in which we live. And I think you see it on television, you see it in advertising. It is a reflection of a set of values that, at least in part, you know, Playboy was there in the beginning for.
I know that the written Playboy philosophy goes on many, many pages, so it may be tough to sum it up concisely here. But if someone said to you, and that someone's going to be me, what is the Playboy philosophy? How would you sum it up?
Well, I was raised in a typically American, very Puritan, repressive home. And what Playboy represents for me is a reaction to that repression. It is a magazine that suggests that life is something more than a vale of tears, that life includes play and pleasure. And I think that America's attitude towards sex has always been rather schizophrenic. You got the Puritans on the one hand and the Founding Fathers on the other that were concerned about that and tried to separate church and state. And I think that Playboy is an entertainment book first and foremost, and says that on its cover, but I think that it is about that part of life. Man, it's been a pleasure to be there all these years.
Have you seen merit over the years in some women's complaints? And I'm not talking about it from a puritanical point of view, because there's plenty of daylight between Puritanism and where you are perceived to be. Women who have said, hey, casting away this repression is great. Erotic notions and expressing them, that's great. But relationships between men and women have to have a greater texture than what Playboy presents. And,
of course.
And if the notion takes hold that young women are to be pursued by older men, this, to the extent that that notion takes hold, it limits the possibilities of women. It hurts their relationships with men. By the way, this isn't necessarily my opinion, but I'm paraphrasing stuff you've heard through the years.
Many times.
I mean, if Susan Brown Miller were sitting here or Gloria Steinem, it'd be a lot more pointed than this. So you've heard it before. What have you said?
Well, what can I say? It doesn't have much to do with my life. It's a political agenda. I don't think it has much to do with real relationships.
You think much of modern feminism is anti-sexual?
I think that the part that's gotten much of the publicity is anti-sexual, without question. The notion that sex itself is somehow the hurtful part of life, the harassing part of life, is a rather sad commentary on what, after all is said and done, is really the most civilizing force on this planet. It is sex, after all, that turns us into family, tribe, country, civilization. I think that we've come through a rather dark decade, and age is a part of it. But I think we've politicalized age. And I think there is less tolerance related to sex, more homophobia, more real communication, or less real communication, and more misunderstanding related to human sexuality now than there was in the 60s and 70s. And I think that's sad.
In light of AIDS, other than the obvious precautions about be careful, how does what you advise change?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question.
In other words, would you live the same lifestyle that you lived in the 1960s in light of AIDS and just simply take more precautions, medical precautions, condoms, the stuff everyone is aware of? Or would you change, actually, the nature of your relationships?
I don't know that I would be living my life much differently, but I do believe that there was a window of opportunity that existed between 1960, the invention of the pill, and the arrival of AIDS in 1980. That was a kind of a magic time. It was almost a time of Eden and time of innocence. So I would imagine, yes, any rational person would, be living his life a little differently than I did then.
Here's something that you wrote. You said, what has come to be called sisterhood is merely an unhappy childhood raised to the level of a political agenda. To take your own neurotic needs and not understand what they are, to avoid dealing with life as it really is, doesn't get you anywhere. In a fascinating kind of way, that's what Gloria Steinem is going through right now, but she doesn't quite see that last piece of it. Now, from the devil's advocate point of view, someone could say, hey, look who's talking. Hefner took his own neuroses, his own repressed childhood, built it up into a glorious lifestyle that worked for him, and labeled it a philosophy. So even if you're right about some feminists, they could apply the same criticism to you.
I think you lost the thought there somewhere. I managed to put together a life that worked and found a great deal of happiness. She's reached the point where she's beginning to question some of the basic premises, and she's not very happy. If my life was really all compulsion and obsession, I don't think I would be as content and happy as I am today. I see a causal connection between the life that I lived before and the wonderful place that I'm at now. But it has been, it's very difficult. We all walk in separate shoes, and I think that I had to deal with the particular devils that were there in my life. I'm a very lucky fella. with whatever problems or conflicts I've had in my life, I've managed to pursue and fulfill most all of my dreams beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. I've lived my life in a very open way, and in doing that, a lot of people have interconnected to it in one way or another. A great many people have seen it in a way that they could identify with. Others have felt threatened by it, or seen it in some other kind of political agenda. That's part of the marvel of being alive and part of the nature of our free society.
Were you, for the most part, content and happy throughout your time as a public figure? Or has this evolved to this point only fairly recently?
Well, I certainly have never been happier or more content than I am right now. But I think this would not be possible if I hadn't been through the other. I think that I pursued my fantasies, adolescent though they might have been, and have lived one hell of a life.
Glad you could join us this evening. I'm Hugh Hefner, editor-publisher of Playboy magazine, and your host.
You're so good, baby, there ain't nobody better. Ain't nobody better. So you should never ever go by the letter. Never ever. You're so cool, everything you do is success. All 'cause you are the best. Yes, you are. Look up in the air, it's your time.
Here's something else that you said. Playboy did more for women's rights than just about anybody, and I'm not just talking about editorializing. Through the Playboy Foundation, we put our money where our mouth was. Not many people realize it, but we're responsible for Roe v. Wade. We funded it. From 65 on, the Playboy Foundation paid for a series of court cases that culminated finally in the Roe v. Wade decision.
Sure.
You think a lot of feminists perhaps look at you the way they might look at philandering liberal senators whose voting record is exactly what feminists would want, but whose behavior disgusts them? And I'm speaking again as a devil's advocate here, where they say, hey, look, Hefner's right. He did all these things. You know, if he were in the Senate, he'd vote as we want him to vote. But the lifestyle frightens us or bothers us.
Is there something really frightening about a lifestyle that is essentially living as a bachelor or the female equivalent? Is that really frightening? Does that frighten people?
Some, it must.
I guess so. But I do think that that is a projection of somebody else's hang-ups.
There's a lot of humorlessness out there.
Well, that's right. And you know, when you get politics, you do get a lot of humorlessness. During the Clarence Thomas hearings, I had the feeling that reality was not in that room, that what was being expressed by both adversaries wasn't real life. Sex was the enemy in that room. And I think that what is squeezed out of that is you know, the real human connections of the way things really are. And you know, we're living in a time in which, you know, the notions of sexual harassment and accusations of child abuse have been lifted to, you know, a position of, have been politicalized in a way that makes it very difficult for a lot of guys to really know, fathers, husbands, suitors to know what is expected of them.
What should the new rules be?
Well, I think we're kind of making them up as we go along here now. They certainly weren't as clear as they used to be. There's a classic scene in Gone with the Wind with Clark Gable where he carries Scarlett up the stairs. In the political perceptions of today, that would be considered sexual harassment, I guess.
A lot of these political perceptions do not take into account the real-life dynamics between people.
That's my point.
It's one thing to offer a political theory, which you or I might readily agree with. It's another thing to try and have each particular situation and each particular life or relationship between two people in all of its complexity exemplify that theory. You go off the railroad tracks with that. And I think that that was at play in the Thomas Hill thing in a way that it is not politically correct to acknowledge.
Well, I think that the very notion of political correctness is rather fascist and scary. The fact that a lot of people, I've spent my lifetime as a liberal, the fact that a lot of people who consider themselves liberals now have an agenda that deals with political correctness is scary to me. Because what makes this country great and the thing that the rest of the world looks to is our freedom and the variety and the varying views and values of our people. The notion that we should now, on our college campuses, be suppressing some of those ideas because they are not, quote, politically correct, unquote, is scary to me. And one has the feeling that when Orwell's 1984 becomes a reality, it may wind up being a liberal agenda. And censorship under any kind of a title is scary.
I'm preaching to the choir on this one, but even so, you got to put in certain stipulations before you walk out on this wire. I was not pleased to see Clarence Thomas nominated for the Supreme Court. I thought it was a transparently cynical thing by President Bush. I would have had no trouble if I were a senator voting against his confirmation without Anita Hill. I think in the context, though, of what happened, there were certain very troubling questions that just weren't convenient for most of us liberals to deal with. It became a referendum on whether or not you thought sexual harassment was a serious issue and whether or not you sympathized with those who might be victimized by it. Any thinking person does. Another factor became this lone black woman standing before a group of white men, and nobody in their right mind wants the Senate or the Congress to be made up 98% of white men. It isn't what America should be about. All those things were troubling. And there's no question that what Anita Hill said resonated with millions of women. That's all to the good. In its sloppy way, it's all to the good in terms of where we come out of this in national awareness. But within that no one wanted to address was, what does this suggest about particular situations? In the United States of America, we want to take a 10-year-old story that has no physical evidence, and we want to take someone, man or woman, and have them answer to something that cannot be disproven in that kind of forum. We want to do, if this were done to a liberal nominee for a non-politically correct charge that was equally egregious in human terms, all of us would be outraged.
Yeah.
It was very troubling in ways that most people didn't have the gumption to note because they thought that that would put them in the camp of being illiberal when it came to the serious issue of sexual harassment.
Well, as I said, I don't think that real life really ever entered that room.
Or humanity. Forgive me for interrupting. Another thing is this. Even if Clarence Thomas were guilty of exactly what Anita Hill said, don't we feel compassion anymore?
We still don't know how to judge it in the context of when you look at it there on television.
Exactly. And don't we feel compassion anymore for the notion that in the intervening 10 years, a man transcends what he once was, a woman transcends what she once was?
Are we also to assume that there is no sexual communication or humor in real relationships, in an office setting. That's part of the road we're walking down. We're walking down a road in which a pinup picture hanging on a wall is sexual harassment. A sexually oriented joke becomes sexual harassment. Real harassment is a scary thing in the office or anyplace else, and it has a great deal to do with power. But to make sex the enemy, to make the images of sex something so offensive that we turn away from it, is turning away from ourselves, is turning away from our own human sexuality and our own human needs, because it would be a very lonely planet if we weren't two sexes and weren't attracted to one another. And to view the notion that sex isn't a key and essential and lovely and very special part of it says something very sad about us.